One important and particularly interesting relationship in Ursula K. Leguin's sixth Earthsea novel, The Other Wind, is that between Tenar and Lebannen. Lebannen, by this time, is a king who has been reigning for 15 years. So he's still a fairly young king, but he's had a lot of experience, and there's some expectations on him that we're going to see enter into this relationship. Tenar has met him 15 years ago when his boat, or ship rather, was sailing near Gant, and in the harbor, she and Therru, now Tahanu, were trying to escape the man, one of the people who had abused Therru, and the king takes them up on board and welcomes her as both somebody who is connected with the former archmage Ged, or Sparrowhawk, who Lebannen had recently come back from this long quest detailed in the third novel with, and who has been avoiding Lebannen. And Tenar and him get to talk quite a bit on the ship as they're sailing towards another one of the harbors, and they get to know each other. And there's a ease and familiarity and friendship that arises between them. What we find in the story is how Leguin says that Lebannen had spent only a brief time with Tenar, though they'd written a few letters over the years. And this is him seeing her again now after 15 years. He was not yet used to her hair being gray, and she seemed smaller than he remembered her. But with her, he felt immediately, as he had 15 years earlier, that he could say anything and she would understand. And it's really interesting because this harkens back all the way to the first Earthsea novel, where Ged and Vetch have that kind of ease of friendship that time does not alter. They're able to pick it up immediately from where they've left off. And so this is going to be quite important. They are there in Havnor, in the very heart of Earthsea, because Therru, or now Tahanu, and Tenar are going to be consulted by the king about some issues that have to deal with dragons. But there's some other problems arising at the same time, the most important of which is this Karghish princess who has been brought and is being essentially given in a attempt to make a bargain by the High King of the Karghish lands, her father, to Lebannen, who is very unhappy about what is going on. And so they're coming to Havnor originally about one problem. They're going to help him deal with a second problem. More Tenar than Tahanu. Tahanu's really dragon preoccupied. And as a matter of fact, Tenar has to help out her daughter, her adopted daughter, Tahanu, to deal with her own emotions and things like that, and to grow into her stature. And what we see is that Tenar is going to give counsel and actually help Lebannen out considerably with the Karghish princess, not least because she is herself originally a Karghish priestess, and so she can relate to a certain degree to what's going on with this unfortunate, as we find out, princess who's been used basically as a bargaining chip and who's lived a very, very sheltered life, but who turns out to be quite a interesting and good person. We also find out that Tenar functions as a sort of surrogate mother to Lebannen. There's a very interesting passage here. Lying gazing at the stars, he turned his mind deliberately from those memories and from the thought of Ged, who he misses and doesn't understand why Ged won't come to see him. He thought of Tenar, the sound of her voice, the touch of her hand. Courtiers were ceremonious, cautious about how and when they touched the king. She was not. She laid her hand on his, laughing. She was bolder with him than his mother had been. Rose, princess of the house of Enlad, had died of a fever 2 years ago while he was on shipboard, coming to make a royal visit to Berlia on Enlad and the isles south of it. He had not known of her death till he came home to a city and house in mourning. His mother was there now in the dark country, the dry country. If he came there and passed her in the street, she would not look at him, she would not speak to him. He clenched his hands. He rearranged the cushions of his bed, tried to make himself easy, tried to set his mind away from there to think of things that would keep him from going back there, to think of his mother living, her voice, her dark eyes under dark arched brows, her delicate hands. Or to think of Tenar. He knew he had asked Tenar to come to Havnor not only to take counsel from her, but because she was the mother that remained to him. A very important phrase. She is the mother that remained to him. He wanted that love, to give it and be given it. The ruthless love that makes no allowances, no conditions. Tenar's eyes were gray, not dark, but she looked right through him with a piercing tenderness, undeceived by anything he said or did. He knew he did well what he had been called to do. He knew he was good at playing king, but only with his mother and with Tenar had he ever known beyond any self-doubt what it was to be king. Not all mothers are like that, of course, right? And not everybody experiences true motherly love or anything like that. And what we find, interestingly, motherly love, and Leguin writes this, of course, as a mother, is not this, absolutely devoted, self-giving thing, oh, I'm nothing, you're everything, sort of nonsense. It is demanding. It asks the best and provides support to the person that it's asking the best of. And if you're the king, well, you have to be the best king. And that is what Lebannen is being called to. There's a couple other passages later on where we see some of this ceremoniousness, but also tenderness. For example, when they're getting on the boat together, Lebannen is going to welcome her. Tenar says, here we go. She thought of the day long ago she and Ged came sailing into Havnor, bringing home the rune of peace, Elpharan's ring. That ring had been on her arm, and she'd held it up so the silver would flash in the sunlight, and the people could see it, and they had cheered and held out their arms to her as if they all wanted to embrace her. It made her smile to think of that. She was smiling as she went up the gangplank and bowed to Lebannen. He greeted her with the traditional formality of a ship's master. Mistress Tenar, be welcome aboard. She replied, moved by she knew not what impulse. I thank you, son of Elpharan. He looked at her for a moment, startled by that name. So they can engage in ceremony, but we also find out a little bit later, right? They're talking about Ged's questions to Hanu, and she says, I don't know what the answers are, only what the princess told me. I'll speak with Tahanu about these things tonight. He frowned, pondering, then his face cleared. He stooped and kissed Tenar's cheek, bidding her good night. He strode off, and she watched him go. Here's a great description. He melted her heart. He dazzled her, but she was not blinded. He's still afraid of the princess, she thought. So she can see into him. She knows him with a sense of intimacy that a mother, a good mother, would have, a good parent would have, to be able to know what's actually going on with your children. She's also upset with him at a certain point, particularly early on when he's explaining what is going on with the princess. And we see some interesting remarks here. Lebannen had left the audience scowling again. What was wrong with him? So far as she knew, he had never before rebelled against the obligations of his position. Certainly he knew a king must marry and has little real choice to whom he marries. He knew that a king who does not obey his people is a tyrant. He knew his people wanted a queen, wanted heirs to the throne, but he'd done nothing about it. Women of the court had been happy to gossip to Tenar about his several mistresses, none of whom had lost anything by being known as the king's lover. He'd certainly managed all that quite well, but he couldn't expect to do that forever. Why was he so enraged by King Thul's offering him a perfectly appropriate solution? Marry my daughter, and our two kingdoms, the two main kingdoms in Earthsea, will be at peace forevermore. We can bind ourselves together, these two ethnicities, these two peoples that have been at war for, hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. And Tenar thinks to herself, imperfectly appropriate, perhaps. The princess was something of a problem. And before we come to the solution, we should read on. She resented Lebannen's failure or inability to take the girl's point of view. She not only is upset about his rebellion, not getting married as he should, and his anger, but also his lack of sympathy, an uncharacteristic lack of sympathy. She says, couldn't he imagine what it was like for her, brought up in the women's quarters of a warlord's fortress in a remote desert land where she'd probably never seen any man but her father and uncles and some priests, suddenly carried off from that changeless poverty and rigidity of life by strangers on a long and frightening sea voyage, abandoned among people whom she knew of only as irreligious and bloodthirsty monsters who dwelt on the far edge of the world, and not truly human at all because they were wizards who could turn into animals and birds, and she was to marry one of them. When you frame it like that, if Lebannen could see things that way, and not just from his own perspective, then perhaps, he could have much more sympathy for this princess. And, we see that this is going to be an issue. She doesn't understand why Lebannen can't exert himself this way, but she's going to help come up with a solution, and that comes back to the helping Lebannen out with the Karghish princess. She is going to teach her. She's going to ensure that she does, in fact, not just learn the Hardic tongue of the archipelago in place of her native Karghish, but that she comes literally out of the shell of her veil and gets to know this person, Lebannen. As a matter of fact, Tenar takes kind of baby steps with this. There's a point where the princess gives her name and then says, don't give it to the king because he'll use it to try to ensorcel me. That's what these people do. And Tenar's like, listen, kid, that's not how things work here. But when Tenar is talking to the king, Lebannen, she says, I can't give you her name yet because she doesn't want you to have it at this point in time. And so Tenar works as a very important go-between and very much like a motherly figure and a future mother-in-law to this Karghish princess who is going to be marrying Lebannen. And the two of them will, in fact, fall in love by the end. But it's going to be largely due to all the efforts that Tenar is pointing in to smooth the way, to figure out what the obstacles are. And, this is going to be an incredibly important relationship going on. And it's kind of a tender picture that we get to see. Tender, and like Tenar, also quite tough. So a really important, supportive relationship that allows us to see these two characters developing in relation to each other and in relation to their duties and their relationships with other characters.